At 6:30 on the 21st of June, 1922, when Count Alexander Ilyich Rostov was escorted through the gates of the Kremlin onto Red Square, it was glorious and cool. Drawing his shoulders back without breaking stride, the Count inhaled the air like one fresh from a swim. The sky was the very blue that the cupolas of St. Basil's had been painted for. Their pinks, greens, and golds shimmered as if it were the sole purpose of a religion to cheer its divinity. As he strode from the square into the lobby of the Hotel Metropole, the Count gave a wide wave with which to simultaneously greet the unflappable Arkady, who was manning the front desk, and sweet Valentina, who was dusting a statuette. Though the Count had greeted them in this manner 100 times before, both responded with a wide-eyed stare. It was the sort of reception one might have expected when arriving for a dinner party having forgotten to don one's pants. He strode up the stairs until he reached the 3rd floor. Then he walked down the red-carpeted hallway toward his suite, an interconnected bedroom, bath, dining room, and grand salon with 8-foot windows overlooking the lindens of Theatre Square. And there the rudeness of the day awaited, for before the flung-open doors of his rooms stood a captain of the guards, with Pasha and Petya, the hotel's bellhops. The two young men met the Count's gaze with looks of embarrassment, having clearly been conscripted into some duty they found distasteful. The Count addressed the officer. "What is the meaning of this, Captain?" The captain, who seemed mildly surprised by the question, had the good training to maintain the evenness of his effect. "As you have been sentenced for the crime of being an aristocrat to live out your days within the walls of this hotel, I am here to show you to your quarters." "These are my quarters." Betraying the slightest suggestion of a smile, the captain replied, "No longer, I'm afraid." Leaving Pasha and Petya behind, the captain led the Count and his escort to a utility stair hidden behind an inconspicuous door at the core of the hotel. Up they wound 3 flights to where a door opened on a narrow corridor servicing a bathroom and 6 closets reminiscent of monastic cells. Earlier that day, the room closest to the stairwell, a tiny one with a slanted ceiling, had been cleared of all but a cast-iron bed, a 3-legged bureau, and a decade of dust. The good captain explained that he had summoned the bellhops to help the Count move what few belongings his new quarters would accommodate. And the rest? Becomes the property of the people. So this is their game, thought the Count. Very well. He skipped back down the belfry, marched along the 3rd floor hallway, and re-entered his suite where the 2 bellhops looked up with woeful expressions. "It's all right, fellows," the Count assured, and then began pointing. "This, that, those, all the books." Among the furnishings destined for his new quarters, the Count chose 2 high-backed chairs, his grandmother's oriental coffee table, and a favorite set of her porcelain plates. He chose the 2 table lamps fashioned from ebony elephants and the portrait of his sister Helena, which Serov had painted during a brief stay at Idlehour in 1908. He did not forget the leather case that had been fashioned specially for him by Asprey in London, and which his good friend Mishka had so appropriately christened the Ambassador. Noting that the guards were eyeing the 2 bottles of brandy on the console, the Count tossed them in as well. And once the trunk had been carried upstairs, he finally pointed to the desk. The 2 bellhops, their bright blue uniforms already smudged from their efforts, took hold of it by the corners. "But it weighs a ton," said one to the other. "A king fortifies himself with a castle," observed the Count. "A gentleman with a desk." Then the Count began his farewell walk. First, he admired the salon's grand dimensions and his 2 chandeliers. He admired the painted panels of the little dining room and the elaborate brass mechanisms that allowed one to secure the double doors of the bedroom. In short, he reviewed the interior much as would a potential buyer who was seeing the rooms for the very first time. Once in the bedroom, the Count paused before the marble-topped table on which lay an assortment of curios. "'Tis a funny thing," reflected the Count as he stood ready to abandon his suite. "From the earliest age, we must learn to say goodbye to friends and family. But experience is less likely to teach us how to bid our dearest possessions adieu, and if it were to, we wouldn't welcome the education. But of course, a thing is just a thing." And so, slipping only his sister's scissors into his pocket, the Count looked once more at what heirlooms remained, and then expunged them from his heartache forever. 1 hour later, the Count bounced twice on his new mattress to identify the key of the bed springs, C#. Then he took a moment to arrange his few remaining possessions. a photograph, the 2 bottles of brandy, and so on. A pigeon landed outside on the copper stripping of the ledge. "Why, hello," said the Count. "How kind of you to stop by." The pigeon looked back with a decidedly proprietary air. Nodding once to the pigeon to indicate that they would resume their discussion anon, the Count rebuttoned his jacket and turned to find that 3 members of the hotel's staff were crowded in the doorway. There was Andre, the maitre d', with his perfect poise and long judicious hands, Vasily, the hotel's inimitable concierge, and Marina, the shy delight with the wandering eye who had recently been promoted from chambermaid to seamstress. The 3 of them exhibited the same bewildered gaze that the Count had noticed on the faces of Arkady and Valentina a few hours before, and finally it struck him. When he had been carted off to trial that morning, they had all assumed that he would never return. He had emerged from behind the walls of the Kremlin like an aviator from the wreckage of a crash. "My dear friends," said the Count, "no doubt you are curious as to the day's events. As you may know, I was invited to the Kremlin for a tête-à-tête. There, several duly goateed officers of the current regime determined that for the crime of being born an aristocrat, I should be sentenced to spend the rest of my days in this hotel." In response to the cheers, the Count shook hands with his guests one by one, expressing to each his appreciation for their fellowship and heartfelt thanks. Come in, he said. Together, the 3 staff members squeezed their way between the towers of furniture, teetering. "If you would be so kind," said the Count, handing Andre one of the bottles of brandy. Then he kneeled before the ambassador, threw the clasps, and opened it like a giant book. From this, he drew 4 brandy glasses and passed them around as Andre, having plucked the cork from the bottle, performed the honors. Once his guests had their brandy in hand, the Count raised his own on high. "To the metropole," he said. "To the metropole," they replied. The Count was something of a natural-born host, and in the hour that ensued, a surprising amount of laughter was present. On this of all nights, the Count deeply appreciated the staff's good cheer. At 10 o'clock, the Count walked his guests to the belfry and bid them good night with the same sense of ceremony that he would have exhibited at the door of his family's residence in St. Petersburg. Returning to his quarters, he opened the window, though it was only the size of a postage stamp, poured the last of the brandy, and took a seat at the desk. If a man does not master his circumstances, he reflected philosophically, then he is bound to be mastered by them.
Welcome to the Imagination Redeemed podcast, where we follow the great stories further up and further in pursuit of the life of Christ.
Welcome back to Imagination Redeemed, everyone. I'm Brian Brown, joined today by Jeremiah England, Sarah Howell, and Christina Brown. And if you are not familiar with the story that I just read, it is part of the opening of the book A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, which is one of my favorite books by a living author. You may remember, if you've listened to our last couple of episodes, that this winter we've been exploring limits and constrictions on our embodied lives. We talked about joviality as the key to magnanimous joy in the face of limits that come against joy. We talked about the limits of time and season in that context. We talked in our last episode about magnanimity itself as the key to practicing generosity within the limits of means. In this episode, we're going to talk about how the limits of space can grow our character, our virtue, and our closeness with God if we let them. We will not be revealing huge book spoilers in case you haven't read it. And I want to call out right away that anytime somebody's doing an episode about a book, people who have read the book can kind of flock to it and go, "Oh, I want to hear this conversation." And people who haven't read the book, A, might worry about spoilers, and B, might just sort of check out. So I want to make sure that all of our listeners understand we're talking about something that we all struggle with. We are in winter and we're stuck inside a lot. And a lot of limits come with that constricted space, monotony, potentially bad habits and patterns, friction or noise from other people. And we're kind of conditioned to view limits as confining in general. Even if we pay lip service to the value of limits, oh yes, limits can create this or that positive benefit. As soon as we experience a new limit, right, we typically respond with frustration, rebellion, grief, whatever. So we're going to be drawing some wisdom from this book in the course of that, but we'll kind of signal what we're doing along the way. So we hopefully won't run into situations where if you haven't read this particular story, heard this particular anecdote, it has no value to you. So I'll sort of kick us off with this quote from Dostoevsky, which is appropriate since this is all Russian themed literature. And then I'll toss it out to you guys with an initial question. In the Brothers Karamazov, Elder Zosima says, "The world says you have desires. Satisfy them. Expand your desires and demand more. This is the worldly doctrine of today. And they believe that this is freedom. The result for the rich is isolation and suicide. For the poor, envy and murder." As I was preparing for this episode, as I was throwing notes around to you guys, as we were talking about it, I was noticing certainly a lot of patterns in Christian writers, whether it's novelists like Dostoevsky or whether it's ancient mystics. They're very, very different perspectives on limits, and particularly limits on space of various kinds. And it definitely had me walking away going, this novel is not unique in raising the notion that there's a way to learn to be the kind of person who is sharpened and grown and even set free by limits. So perhaps, guys, we could start by just jumping into that story that we opened with. I kept most of what was in the book when I was adapting it for reading, because there's a lot of detail in there that's, I think, is worth our conversation. So maybe just as a softball to start us off, I would just love to know from each of you what strikes you, and listeners, you can think about this too. What strikes you about Count Rostov's immediate response to his new situation? This is brand new to him. Like 5 minutes ago, he was told, you came this close to being executed. Now you are going to be under house arrest in this hotel, can't leave the hotel for literally the rest of your life. And oh, by the way, we're taking away your room within the hotel and most of your stuff. What's your response to, or what strikes you about his response?
One of the things I like in the book that he talks about later is he kind of makes a comparison of himself to Robinson Crusoe. And he says, like his kind of his way of responding to life that he tries to achieve is be an Anglican washed ashore like Crusoe and fashion a life out of your difficult circumstances. And it is almost like that. Robinson Crusoe is trapped on this island. Everything he's known and loved is taken away from him. And yet he's able to build a life such that, I think he even mentions the book, after Crusoe gets off the island, like 3 years later, he's like, I got to find my island and get back there again, because that's where his life is. But, I think there's something to that, like almost hardcore practicality of being the master of your circumstances so that your circumstances don't master you. And his approach to that, I think, is very much so. He's like, okay, I'm washed ashore. It's time to salvage what I can and start rebuilding. And I think that's throughout the book.
Mm-hmm. As a side note, I loved it. It sounded to me like when you said Robinson Crusoe, it sounded like you were saying Robinson Caruso. And I just have this image of CSI Miami, like Robinson.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, what else?
Well, just to Jeremiah's point, I think of, just saying that Swiss Family Robinson, same concept, right? Only they have like a family, right? Like it's I guess husband, wife, and 3 boys or something like that. And same concept, like we're either going to die or we're going to build a life. And they turn it into this grand adventure. And I remember as a kid reading that, I was just like, wow, this is what people can do with stuff like this.
The point about family is really important when we think about the Count, because even though he is alone, so he is like Robinson, he brings along with him the items from his past and from his family. I'd love to have a little bit of a conversation about how he brings the bottles of brandy almost because he noticed the soldiers escorting him wanted them.
Bit of rebellion there.
Yeah.
Speaking of the brandy, Sarah, if I remember right, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he takes those bottles of brandy to eventually give to the guards, as somewhat of a bribery and to curry favor. And I think it's excellent foreshadowing for kind of his whole character arc in the rest of the book. Because I know one of the things that we wanted to talk a little bit about is the juxtaposition of this as being a very winter book, where I definitely, as I was reading it, always had the feeling that like the winter outside was omnipresent. Like there were no other seasons for this guy other than just the coldest, merciless Russian winter ever. And yet what's interesting about the book is he's able to find such a deep sense of warmth throughout the whole book. And in my notes, I wrote, warmth is a deep, delighted consideration of others. And I think that's kind of like how he lives his life. And so even in this very, very beginning thing, as he's getting out all of his possessions, you know, he might be just thinking about the horrible situation I had, or the fact that I had a near-death experience, and, you know, what's my life going to be like? You know, he, even in that moment, was considering the guards and going, oh, what is it that they want? You know, and, you know, maybe he did it selfishly as a way to curry favor later, but I think it just kind of speaks to the fact that throughout the book, he always has a consideration of other people and what their goals are and what it is that they need at the moment. And that's what ends up, you know, really blossoming him as a person inside this prison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the fact that he gets up to this attic and the hotel staff, the people who were essentially his servants 5 minutes ago, his first reaction is hospitality. And in general, you see this in his selection of some of the items. A gentleman fortifies himself with a desk, all the books, the hospitality element. You can tell he is a very, his character is very disciplined already. He has a lot of good habits already. And his first response within this tragedy is not even to, you know what, I'm just going to give myself a day to grieve before I wrestle with what to do here. Not that that would be illegitimate. His first reaction is just to keep being himself, to keep living out the same habits. And like you said, Jeremiah, to project that warmth toward those around him. He doesn't let himself stop being, you know, a lover of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and so on, for a moment, which is really striking to me.
I also noticed the interpersonal relationship that he had clearly built with the people of the hotel. Kind of like you said, Brian, they were his servants, but notice that when he told them what was going on, they cheered. Like they were like, oh my gosh, our friend is here. Yeah. And when he offered them brandy, I noticed too that the guy didn't, you know, I don't remember his name, Andre or something, did not hesitate. He's like, yeah, I'll pop it. You know, like he just clearly knew that Count Rostov like considered him an equal. And clearly that was a very normal thing. And they were just all ready to be there with him. And that just, I think, immediately setting that up as a part of the book, that says a lot about his character.
And I think, Christina, you were the one mentioning this before we started recording, but I was struck in the opening story today how much this story is framed from not the Count losing everything and getting shoved into this closet, but actually this Count going from death to life, right? Like he should have died. They all thought he wasn't going to come back. And so there's this kind of gratitude and celebration in the midst of all of the loss. And I think that that's kind of a really nice pattern for this character in his, not only in like what we see play out, but also in like the kind of habits he has shaped in himself and the kind of literal character formation he has.
Death to life, perhaps. I do wonder how much, I mean, because we talk about like how we need limitations to kind of give us the kind of freedom that we crave, but there seems to be, and how that can kind of form our character, but there seems to be already when the story starts a kind of character that he already has formed. So he didn't come into this circumstance kind of as a ne'er-do-well, rich, you know, guy who's used to getting his own way. He came in clearly already with some kind of understanding of what really mattered in life. And I think that's worth noting. And I think because of that, he had some kind of, I would say maybe like, I guess as a Christian, we might say like a gratitude. And as far as etymology of gratitude, it's like goes way back. Some say it goes to Sanskrit. I never know how to pronounce that. But as far as Latin, it's pleasing and pleasant, and then of course full. So full of pleasure and pleasing and pleasance. And I think when we as Christians, we don't always know what grateful really means, but I think it also means really recognizing the beauty around us and letting that fill us. And then that becomes a sense of blessing. And then that becomes like it goes into like this gratitude for life, for living. And again, like when he chose the things, it was very intentional. And he was mourning the things on his dresser, but he did grab one thing and they were his sister's scissors, you know? And you kind of in your head, you're like, huh, that's interesting. And you're kind of like, well, I wonder what else was there. And and so so he has this connection to things, but there's also, as you can kind of see, the things that he chooses do have a higher symbolism. There's something else there. Things are just things. However, when he connects the bigger picture and the people and the things they represent, sort of the gentleman has a desk, like there's an entire statement there to unpack, even in why he chose that desk, you know? So yeah, I kind of wonder where that kind of fits into the bigger picture of who he is.
Yeah. So we're talking about this big picture about how his disciplines, his own character formation prior to these unexpected constraints prepared him for the unexpected constraints. As we go on, I'll sort of just telegraph this for you listeners. I want to kind of progress through how he responds to different phases of the constraints. So the first one is just the initial one. How does who he is, how has that prepared him for this? Next, I want us to get into how constraint can drive self-examination, how limits can force us to look at ourselves in ways that we might not have otherwise. Third, I want to get into how constraints can drive creativity. And fourth, how constraints can clarify purpose. Because he goes through each of those phases. So listeners, just so you have a sense of where this is going, I think what the last couple of things I've heard from you are a good transition into, and we can still talk about some of the same topic, but getting into that second one, how constraints can drive self-examination. Obviously, when we're constrained by space, it doesn't always mean solitude, right? It does in his case. It could mean the opposite. Winter, if you have kids, it can mean a lot of loud noise. But when limits do permit or even require solitude, that solitude can force us to truly reckon with ourselves. I would love to hear from you all what that looks like, either what you see in the story or how we as humans can allow the solitude to move our gaze productively inward. Because obviously there's lots of unhealthy ways we can get obsessed with ourselves. But if we're forced by circumstances to kind of look ourselves in the mirror, what does it look like to do that well as far as responding to limits?
Yeah, I'm not even sure it's so much solitude, at least in this book, because I can't really think of a whole lot of times where he's really like by himself for very long before he's either joined by someone or, because I mean, he really does spend a lot of his time like focused on other people. And I think, the main thing is he goes through, like you said, great loss and great limitations. And the thing about it is like, it's almost like a triage for him where he's able to cut out all of the, surface level stuff. And even, he's forced so hard that he has to even cut out all the mid-level stuff. And like Christine was saying, like, he can take one thing off his desk. And so he took the thing of his sisters, right? And it's like that kind of limitation and loss was able to give him focus on what actually really mattered to him. And, he was able to form relationships with people that probably would have just stayed at as a surface level. His relationship with the cook and with the maitre d' at the restaurant, and his relationship with the little girl that he meets, probably would have been very kind of surface level relationships if he stayed at Count. But because he kind of lost everything, he had to really focus on the things that really mattered.
Nice.
And take them, not only relationships, but take all of life from that shallowness into more depth. The image that's in my head a lot right now is an illustration that Blaise Pascal uses about being on board a ship to explain like the relative external success that can kind of look. Well, when everyone is at the same task on the boat busying themselves, the ship is moving. And so he says, quote, when everything is moving at the same place, nothing appears to be moving. The one person who stops shows up the haste of others, like a fixed point. The busying activity of being on the same pace, being a count, doing the things that counts do, we could say that when he gets off that pace and he stops, there's opportunities that open up for him to really start practicing what he preaches in a lot of ways, right? If he's a gentleman, what does it mean to be a gentleman? It might mean to show respect to the person next to you. But what does it mean to really show respect to the person next to you, especially if you are now not equal in status, but now you're serving them, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does respect really look like then? That's a second layer that goes from the shallow public facing into like what's happening inside of him in order to really show respect. And I don't know if I finally found the loose ends of all those strings and pulled them together, but there is to me something about the count being a count and caring about the values that he saw as noble, and then stopping the pace of what it means to be in the status of count, and yet still live them out, and how that almost requires a deeper aspect of him than the shallow public facing count.
Yeah. It's striking as the story goes on and the count interacts with different people. I think this is more and more true as the story goes on, because he knows the book follows a good chunk of his life, and so he actually sees people who come regularly to the hotel, and he essentially watches them grow up, watches them at different stages in their lives, and it's striking how the vast majority of interactions he has with people who are not the hotel staff, people who are guests at the hotel, they're so characterized by the way that the current of the world is kind of pulling them along, what they're thinking about, what they're worrying about, where they're setting their aspirations. So much of it is driven by these external Soviet Russia era developments. And to the Count, those things, and to the reader, right? Because you're looking at it from the Count's perspective. He, on the other hand, has this posture of like, if the walls keep closing in and I keep losing one thing after another that I think defines me, who am I? And there are points in the story where he struggles with that question, but overall, he hangs on to it at a very deep level because of what you're talking about, Sarah, because he's kind of the still point who recognizes that no matter how small the context might get, I still have the ability to be me. I still have the ability to have a relationship with the people around me, and meaningful relationship. I mean, and you fast forward a few years, he's learned needlework with Marina, and he's learned waitering and hospitality with Andre, and he's learned menu planning with Emil, the cook. And so in a weird way, yeah, he's turned himself outward now in his quest for self-examination. Essentially, he's learned to discover himself by doing his duty, I guess would be a way of framing it, rather than by just sort of navel gazing on the one hand or going with the current of what's going on the other.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there is something about, and I honestly don't know how you get there. I mean, it might just be lots of prayer and discipline and whatnot, but I think there's a point, and I've definitely learned this the hard way in my own life, but there's a point where you're so tired of self-pity and um, just hating your circumstances or yourself or the things that you find yourself in. And there's a point where you have to go out either into an outside world. For me, it's literally stepping out into my backyard to look at like life outside my four walls. But and I think in Count Rostov's case, it's going to people, right? Going to relationships. People he might not necessarily, as Count, as a rich guy, have truly encountered, to know the life of a seamstress, to know the life of a cook, to know the life of a server. Um, and there's something about allowing the things outside ourselves, I think, to fully enchant us. And I think enchantment is kind of where a lot of this fullness and living into ourselves comes from. And I think we do have to let those small things take hold of us by emptying ourselves first. There is a point where we have to sort of step outside ourselves to let other things enchant us. It's the looking at different things, the people around us. Count Rostov, in his case, it would be, learning needlework, the life of a seamstress. It's learning the life of a server or the cook. And if he had been that rich, man, he probably would not have delved so deep into their lives. And I know that's something that's hard for a lot of us when we're just so consumed with ourselves. And I think there's something about emptying ourselves and letting enchantment fill us. And that's where we find our true contentment. That's where we find the pleasance of life. And so sometimes I think that contentment and gratitude, even, feeling full of pleasure, right, as the etymology would suggest, comes from a quietude, right? It comes from a letting oneself be approached by the things of this world or the beauties of this world that we wouldn't necessarily open ourselves to.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of bumping up against our third point about the relationship between limits and creativity. And I suspect all of you have thoughts on this one. But I think about there's a point in the book where he's befriended this little girl and she has essentially a skeleton key to the whole hotel. And the result of that, like before getting the key, like he thought he knew the hotel. He had literally had lived there for years. But all of a sudden, when he has this key, he explores the underbelly of it, all the back rooms and all the secret passageways, and the physical boundaries of the hotel actually drive him into this place of creativity and exploration, sort of inward and downward rather than outward. So rather than getting broader, he's getting deeper. He has to work within these walls, but he discovers that within the walls is much bigger than he thought he was. What else have you guys noticed from the story or elsewhere about the relationship between limits and creativity?
To tie what you just said, Brian, also to what I was thinking about with where Christina took us, there's something to me coming together here with the concept of excellence.
Okay.
I see the Count as being someone who strives for excellence in all these things, but something that the whole building seems to be maybe a symbol for in that is that he puts his love of excellence into the things that are inward or downward, as opposed to kind of the status of authority or of identity in the world. He goes to the lower things, the humble things. and the inward workings of the hotel that isn't for the posh almost, right? And it's in those constraints that I feel like the things that make him who he is, the kind of character he came into the situation with, like flourish, right? It's like the humble work of the service in excellence that allows, like you were saying, Christina, allows for us to be filled with the beauty around us and things of that nature. So I don't know, your house, I'm calling it a house. Your comments, Brian, about the hotel kind of grounded that for me in a way that is abstract, but that's a very concrete example of like inward and downward.
Yep. I mean, elephant in the room. I when Christina and I tried to go on a vacation in 2021 in Europe, and I tested positive for COVID right after we landed, and so our wonderful like 10th anniversary vacation turned into 10 days mandatory quarantine by myself in a hotel room that was like barely better than prison, both in terms of the food that was delivered and in terms of the actual amenities of the box.
It was bad, y'all. It was really bad.
and they put her in a separate room, but she hadn't tested positive, so she could at least kind of venture out, but we were completely separated.
12 days.
And first of all, I did not handle the initial shock nearly as well as the Count handled his initial shock. But this story was really inspiring to me in that experience, because Count Rostov had been through essentially the same thing, only much worse for much longer. And I was able to think about, how did he handle this? So like one of my first reactions was to kind of turn to the disciplines that I had learned, and in some cases to sort of put them on steroids. How can I order my day in a way that is meaningful? So I actually set limits on screen time and stuff like that. Like how can I, what books can I read? Thankfully, I still had a Kindle and very slow but functional internet access. And what does this look like in terms of staying in shape? And what does this look like in terms of daily prayer? And it wasn't me trying to be holy. That was me trying to reckon with my circumstances. But like the next place that I turned was this direction of creativity. So there were books I was reading I wouldn't have read otherwise. They were sort of writing, doing things I wouldn't have done otherwise. And I kept coming back to
You wouldn't otherwise have played lots of online Scrabble with your wife.
That's also true. See, social, reaching out to the people around you.
Probably one of your most memorable vacations, and great story to tell too. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, my story was one thing that Count Rostov has that I didn't have, other than digital interaction with Christina. There's a great Wendell Berry quote he says, "Our human and earthly limits, properly understood, are not confinements, but rather inducements to fullness of relationship and meaning. Creativity springs from limits." And I love that Rostov has that instinct. As we've noted, he has conducted himself, even as an aristocrat, in a way that has built relationships with these people who on paper were his underlings. And the result of his limitations is he just pours himself into those relationships, and the meaning in each relationship goes deeper and deeper, as do the skills that he develops along the way. What other thoughts do you guys have related to this creativity topic?
Well, I mean, so I think you can really see this a lot if you study any kind of filmmaking, because time and time again, you'll hear directors and writers and filmmakers basically say, it was actually so much easier to make something when I had a lower budget, or when I had, no actor. And so I had to come up with something on the fly. And I think that, when you're creating something, you want to create something new, right? But human nature is like water, right? It just goes the path of least resistance. It's always going to just flow down the path of least resistance like everything else, right? And then when something blocks you, that's when you drift off and cut new interesting paths. And I think anytime that you're trying to make something, all of the limitations and problems that you have are actually gifts. They're gifts to get you to somewhere that's new and interesting.
It's also just very human. We're not Count Rostov, but we all do have a life that is confined to particularity. I do not live Brian's life, and Brian doesn't live mine, nor does Jeremiah, right? And you guys have different families with different needs, as do I, or someone who's single and the freedoms they have, or the limitations they have. I mean, if we think about the story, the creation story in Genesis, God makes everything and it's expansive and abundant, and yet he gives us a little garden. And I put the word little on it, but it's definitely not the whole world, right? It's manageable and it's something to begin with. And I think that if we all see our lives as the garden God's given us, and as the Count sees his little space as what has given to him, like you're saying, Jeremiah, we stop thinking that we have these endless possibilities with a big budget as a filmmaker, and we just start working within the confines and seeing those as opportunities because they're intentionally given to us by God. Maybe because what others intended for evil, he will use for good, but they are still given to us by God.
You've got the cutting out all of the excess in your life is a painful thing because we love all of these things. And, if you think about the Count, like everything that he lost, all of his wealth, his status, his, traveling adventures, family, everything like that. I mean, he lost some real things. And, a lot of times it is those things that, I guess it's never easy to get down to the nitty gritty. We're all kind of like hoarders, right? Where we've got, a million things and we're like, oh yeah, I gotta get rid of all this stuff. I'm going to take this one thing out. And then, everything should be better when you've got like just rooms full of all the excess stuff that we collect. And so, those times of loss and limitations are always really difficult because all the stuff that we're losing are things that we love or like, but that's the only way to really get down to what really matters. The famous Hemingway quote, right? Where he's like, you've got to kill your darlings. You got to cut your story in places that really hurt. And that's the only way you're going to get down to actually the really good part of the book, because you just collect so many things that you want.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I love that. And thinking of it in terms of the kenosis, right? The self-emptying. And I think there's actually a couple quotes from church fathers. And Maximus the Confessor had a great point. He said that aesthetic constraints, kind of like thinking of Count Rostov, right? Going from that beautiful, beautiful room and salon and dining room and bedroom to this tiny little room in the attic, right? And getting rid of all the stuff that he had to. Anyway, aesthetic constraints clear away attachments that clouds us up, he says. They don't create virtue, but they reveal God's natural goodness already present. And then John of the Cross, I love his famous maxim here. He says, to reach satisfaction in all, desire its possession in nothing. To come to the knowledge of all, desire the knowledge of nothing. To come to possess all, desire the possession of nothing. To arrive at being all, desire to be nothing.
Yeah, there's that consistent pattern in the ancient writings of, we had a good conversation about this actually in the Christian imagination class that I'm teaching. Several people were asking about this, like why were some of the mystics so extreme in their asceticism? And we had a conversation about some of their specific circumstances. But one of the things that's pretty consistent in the actual teaching from those people is not that, I think it was Bonaventure who said that like it's not an end in itself. Poverty, this limits of means and space and whatever it is, are not an end in itself. But there are really good means of ensuring two essential Christian virtues: the fundamental humility that every Christian should have before God and the charity that is the Christian life. Or this isn't an ancient quote, but I think I wrote this one down. Simone Weil, like she said, I love this quote: "Grace fills empty spaces, but it can only enter where there is a void to receive it. And it is grace
He knows.
itself which makes this void."
That sounds like what Flannery O'Connor must have tried to write in all of her short stories over and over and over again. And that void and cutting into that space and making room can be really painful. And I think you mentioned this already in the beginning, Brian, very early. Like we give lip service to this concept, but when it happens inside of us, it's painful. And Jeremiah, you just said, like, for good reason, it is painful. You know, there's something truly good that might be lost. And yet I'm kind of pulling all this together for myself. Christina, the concept of letting beauty fill that, and that's grace, you know? That's really, really comforting to me as someone who grieves first and then can stay there.
It's kind of, I think, extra interesting just in our current kind of American culture too, because we really do have like a lives of excess in a lot of ways, whether it's our material possessions or just even there's a million things trying to get every second of our attention and time with entertainment and activities and things like that. And it's interesting to see kind of the cultural backlash to that too, and like what people are trying to do to figure it out. It's funny, as you were talking, I was like, the real Christian theological thing I'm thinking of is the movie Fight Club from the 90s, where the guy is like, it starts out with him just saying how much he just loves his apartment and all the things he buys in it, and then he blows it up, and is like pretending to be really sad, but it's really because like, his inner conscience is like, you work a job you hate to buy things you don't need to impress people that you can't even respect. And, it's like, I think we do feel like we're trapped by everything, by the lives that we built around ourselves. And the only thing that's going to save us is if it all just completely explodes. And maybe that's why stories like this resonate with us, because, in some way we're like, man, I wish I could get out of this. And it's hard, people that are hoarders, they need someone else to come in and like tear everything out to let them start fresh, because it's really hard to do on your own.
Yeah. If we go to the fourth point though, about clarifying purpose, the one thing that I do want to note too though, and this was a conviction that I had this past weekend in terms of what was happening in my life, and then also as I was reflecting on these notes, I am the wife of someone in the Navy, and so someone else, very external from us, will sometimes on a whim decide where we're going to be. And, there's a sort of ease to having really, really intense constraints that are always new. And there's a freedom there that I think goes well with the kind of cultural milieu I've grown up in. What I realized is scary to me is being someone who lived in the same town with the same people, and I'm constrained by the needs of my family, immediate or extended. But I think it's the commonplace and the mundane. Brian, you quoted where Dostoevsky says, "The poor envy." And I think there's a poorness in monotony. Like, we can be poor of new experiences and be envious of something new. So we might be sitting around feeling like, okay, Jeremiah, but I don't have that much excess. I actually am very sad with how little I have and how there's not opportunity coming my way. And I think there's a difference between like the cutting of things that are filling up our spaces, metaphorically or figuratively, but then there's also the reckoning of what do we do in what feels a little bit more empty than it perhaps should be. So I don't know if I'm just trying to get in another angle of something we've already said, so I'm repeating it, but it did feel important to say that, like, it's not just cutting up of the excess, but it's noticing the gaps and it's noticing the losses that are present and asking God, what do you want with these spaces and how can they be opportunities for you to work in my life?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely loss isn't the end all of it. In fact, to bring us back to Fight Club, it didn't end well for this guy. He got rid of all the excess junk in his life and then was left with, violence and depravity and it was not good, right? But you look at like and I think almost maybe he had more of an envious response, whereas all throughout the book, I can't think of a single time that Count Rostov envied anyone. And again, it was that exact opposite. It was that warmth. It was that he was delighted to consider other people. One of my favorite scenes in the book, just real quick, is like, he's at a dinner by himself, alone, and there's a couple that's sitting next to him. There's like a young man who's trying to kind of impress his date, right? And I mean, if it was me, I'd probably be there like, oh, I'm alone. I'm never going to find love. I'm stuck in this stupid hotel. But instead, he's going, oh, man, I bet he's having trouble figuring out the perfect wine pairing. And I happen to know the perfect wine pairing. And he's like rooting for him the whole time. He's just like focused on wanting this young man to succeed. And then ends up intervening and basically is like, I can save this whole date for this guy, by sharing my expertise with him and stepping in. And I think it really speaks to that, even though he's sitting there alone for the 900th time in the row, eating the same thing at the same table, he was again focused on somebody else and how he could bring something delightful into their lives. This love that he had for fine wine, its perfect pairing, and it's not the most expensive, but it's going to fit because of this, and it's going to help your conversation, this type of thing. It's yeah. I mean, he had a delighted consideration of other people, and that was the whole difference. That's why he was able to lose everything and instead gain so much more.
Yep.
I love that. It's funny because it actually reminds me of a sort of a dual Bible quote here that they almost seem to contradict each other, but not, especially in context of that story, Jeremiah. And it's when Jesus says it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. But he also says, what father does not desire to give good gifts to his children? And so there's this beautiful contrast of, yes, I do want to give you good things, and you are supposed to want them and desire them and love them, and you see here the Count, who has had this love and, of fine wines, still enjoys it. But he's able to give it to someone else in this way that he might not necessarily have done before. And so there is this, he does enjoy this good gift and he has it, but he also is ready to give it away, partly because, of his lack of, things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this orientation that he has, one of my favorite sort of narrative turns in the book. Every chapter in this book is just delightful by itself. The prose is beautiful. There are so many great little observations about human nature along the way. First time I read this book, I read it really slowly because sometimes I would read not even a chapter, I'd read like 2 pages. And those 2 pages were just so full of beauty and richness that I would just close the book and think about them for a
I
while.
remember
And
that.
I would just pick it up again and repeat so it took me a while to get through it. But he has this warmth toward others, but it's not obligation. I mean, it might be in a sort of an existential sense, but it's sort of like the like the couple on the date. That's kind of his choice, right? He didn't have to intervene. But as the book goes on, he starts to run into these situations where unexpectedly, for someone who has no family and is under house arrest the rest of his life, he starts to encounter obligation. He learns some of these skills with the hotel staff, and next thing you know, he's actually helping run the hotel with the staff. He's responsible for the tables all being perfect before the guests come in for dinner. There's a key moment in the book where something terrible is about to happen, and the thing that saves the whole situation is a total stranger asks him to care for some honeybees. And then the last portion of the book, which I won't spoil, is he's actually asked to care for another person, another human soul who has to rely on him totally. And there's a great quote about that where he says that he's talking about parents in general, and he's not a parent. But he says, in the end, a parent's responsibility could not be more simple: to bring its child safely into adulthood so that she could have a chance to experience a life of purpose and, God willing, contentment. If that's what parenting is, he has this opportunity and obligation, as it turns out, to basically to pass on what he has learned to someone else. And that ends up being the hinge point that changes the whole story. All right, we are wrapping up for the day because we could talk about this book for hours and we're not going to. But any parting thoughts on anything we've talked about, haven't talked about, or the book itself that you want to leave our listeners with?
What you were saying, as far as parenting, I think, at least for me in my life, this was probably where I learned this lesson the most, just because when I had kids, it was very difficult and there was a lot of extenuating circumstances. And, I felt in that moment when I started having children that I lost everything. All the things that I really enjoyed about my life, I lost, whether it was with the way that I had a relationship with my wife, all my different hobbies and interests and dreams and passions and things I was going to go do, it just basically all got completely derailed. And, I felt kind of like the Count, where I was like trapped in this thing. And, it wasn't until years later that, I was able to then have the perspective and see like how much, I had gained that I could never think of. And, that transitional process where you kind of lose all of your sort of favorite things to find newer, greater, richer things is, it's like kind of a part of growing up and becoming a mature person. And it's funny, I always tell any of my friends that have kids this, because I was like kind of the first of my friend group to ever have children and stuff. And so I would basically like tell my friends, look, everyone says having children is like the best thing that will ever happen to you. What they don't tell you is that having children is also the worst thing that will ever happen to you. It costs you everything. Your whole life is going to change. It's like buckle up, buddy type of thing. But then once you have like the kind of longer experience, then you're able to see, every parent for the most part, says, oh, wouldn't change having children for the world, because we're able to see that great thing. And I think it is only because it costs us so much to have children. And in the book, again, spoilers and such, but he kind of goes through that same thing. And there's that moment in the book when he's like faced with a choice of what he's going to do, where he's like, ah, man, I can't sit in my favorite chair. And I like, all of the little pleasures that he had kind of regained in his hotel, like he had to lose them all again, but then again, 10 years after that, he looks back at it going, man, this is so much better than I ever thought it could be.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful picture of self-sacrifice for something else better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Parenting is such a great way to practice self-sacrifice, to be forced into it,
Well, reading for this episode was so rich for all of us, both the book itself and some of the theological writings that we encountered around it. So I think it's appropriate to leave with a couple of good quotations, not from the book, that just didn't work into the conversation yet. But I think they put a nice bow on this conversation. The book is not told from an explicitly Christian perspective, but we're approaching it from that perspective for obvious reasons. So I think we're putting one little extra layer of spiritual meaning to some of this. And so, all right, quote number one. This is Francois Fenelon, a Roman Catholic French archbishop and poet from the 17th century. He said, "It is when God appears to have abandoned us that we must abandon ourselves most wholly to God." I need to write that one down somewhere because I keep thinking of it in important moments and not being able to quite remember it just right. But it's so dang. And I'll let Julian of Norwich, it's been about a year since we did our episode on Julian of Norwich, so it's appropriate, I think, to give her the last word. She said, "He said not, thou shalt not be tempested, thou shalt not be travailed, thou shalt not be diseased, but he said, thou shalt not be overcome. Thanks for joining me, guys. Thanks for listening, friends, and we will see you next time.
The Imagination Redeemed podcast is a production of the Anselm Society. It's easy to see this world as disenchanted and to give up hope that there's more. But you were made to see the world with the eyes of heaven and to live a bountiful life that participates in the life of God, like in the great stories. To help make this show possible, go to anselmsociety.org/podcast25 and make a donation. The Anselm Society is a place where you can come in and experience that beauty, joyful celebration, and ancient wisdom, and go out renewed, bringing that life to your vocation, home, and church. Learn more at anselmsociety.org and join us next time as we pursue a renaissance of the Christian imagination together.